Yo! What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Today, I want to make this look reasonable, okay? We are looking at, training a neural network right now. We're building up a neural network training framework from scratch, with the goal of kind of like isolating barcodes. So right now we're kind of doing like a pretty simple training loop. We're procedurally generating some barcodes, we're slapping them on top of some other images, and we're kind of saying like, hey, neural network, could you please learn where these things are? We've got like some sort of success here, right? So like here, the barcodes here, after training for like a couple minutes before stream started here, we have like some sort of like mask that approximately, starts to like isolate this thing, right? So this is here, we got a little farther, let's look at like this one, so this is kind of centered here. This one, he struggled a little bit more, but with more training time, maybe he would learn. This one, it's here it's here, right? We're learning something. But we are going too slow. Specifically for stream, we need to make sure that like when we are training, we can train into something that's like kind of okay and reasonable relatively fast, and then like we want the kind of like the back end of training to kind of be it can take longer, but we want to like approach something reasonable quickly. And what we're finding right now is that we cannot do that. Leo, thank you for the 10 gifties, much appreciated. Okay, so what are we doing? The way that like training works, hand wavy, is we like have a bunch of examples that we show to the neural network, right? We have all of these. We give him all these guys at once, and we let him do anything, right? We let him do whatever he wants. Hand wave within like some limits. So we kind of like set up like an architecture for him who says like we're gonna do like these steps, but we don't know like how we're going to tune those steps, right? So we show him the examples, and he gets the end, and he says, "Oh no, I was really wrong." And with like a teeny little bit of calculus, you can say, how was like the incorrectness, like how did each parameter of our network contribute to how wrong we were? Hand wavy, right? It's actually more like, how would an infinitesimally small change in this parameter affect the output? And you can use that kind of like, like you've got like a hill here. Say that this is like the parameter space, right? You have a knob that you're turning, and as you turn that knob from like low to high, maybe it kind of like looks something like this, where this is like y value here is like incorrectness, right? So you kind of want like the incorrectness to be low, and so you're kind of trying to like nudge this guy this way down towards the low part here, right? Hand wavy. So what we're doing right now is we kind of calculate at any given point, say we're like right here on this line. We calculate like the slope of this segment, and we just kind of nudge it downhill, right? Which works like okay, but looking at like this picture, you can see the like flaws in this immediately, right? Because we might be here, and we might go like this way instead of this way. We might go here, and we might go this way instead of this way, right? If we're here, we might go this way. But like if you look at this, there's some sort of like, you could like average out a bunch of this, and it would like look kind of at like a large scale, like you could go in the right direction. So the problem right now is that we have like a noisy signal, and we are trying to nudge it. So we can't nudge it too hard, because if we nudge it really hard, like say we have like, something like this. If you are like on the uphill, but you're trying to go like trend towards this like overall downhill, you'll see up, and if you go too far, you'll set the parameter way too high, and next iteration you'll be like way out of whack, right? You'll be in like totally wrong spot. That's kind of hand wavy what we're looking at. And so what we want something where we can increase the learning rate, but only apply like we want to apply a like smooth signal, as well as maybe make sure that if we're really far from the correct answer, that we get to the correct answer faster, right? Say you have like one parameter where you're kind of like here and the right answer's here, right? So you don't really have that far to go. You only have to go a little bit. But if you're like another parameter where it's like you're over here and the right answer's here, or maybe like something kind of like more like this, right? You're like way over here and the right answer's over here. Well, this guy, you want to take like a bigger step, right, towards the center because you're trying to get closer to the right answer faster. So these are kind of like the problems that we're trying to solve right now, is that we want our initial steps to be fast and converge on like a semi-approximate correct place quickly. And we want to do it without exploding and putting like completely invalid parameters and going like out into the middle of fucking nowhere, right? And so now enter Adam. Adam is this guy from this paper. No, he's not a guy. He's a method from some paper, supposedly from like around 2015, according to this. And the idea is, instead of just saying what is the slope of this infinitesimally small point, what if we could do some sort of intelligent averaging and smoothing and whatever, right? This is kind of built off a bunch of other things, but this is basically what comes out of this thing. And it looks insane when you look at it. When I was first looking at it, I was like, what the fuck is happening? How would anybody ever have come up with this? But when you actually start walking through it piece by piece, it starts to make kind of like sense. Okay? So, let's start there. What is this? And then once we like understand it, then we can implement it. Right? So let's kind of start with some like simpler concepts, right? Let's ignore that math for a second and say that we have some noisy signal, and let's like kind of like take it out of the context of like neural network training for a second. Let's just say that like we have like a temperature sensor on the wall that we're trying to read, and that temperature sensor is maybe like a little bit noisy. It's not like really getting like the perfect temperature every time. But like, so maybe like he reads like, 22.5 degrees, then 22.3 degrees, then 22.4 degrees, then 22.7 degrees, then 22.6 degrees. And you don't really want to like, if this is all happening within the span of a second, like you don't want to like see the number like fluctuating all over, right? You kind of want like over like the last second or two, what was the time, right? So maybe what you would do is you would try to take like a moving average of these things, right? Imperial units, please? No. Boo. I live in Canada where we use normal units. And so like you might want to say, I want to average the last like 10 things that happened, right? The last second of data. And to do that, it turns out that you kind of need to stash every sample that you're averaging over the last period of time, right? So you might store like 10 samples over the last 1 second, and you'll calculate the average over that time by like adding all these up and then dividing them by 10. And then you get a new sample in, you push that new sample over here, you pop this one off, and you average these 10 samples now. This is really great because you get like a smooth signal. So if your signal like kind of looked like this over time, this like moving average will give you something that looks kind of like more like this, right? Which is great. It's wonderful. And this also, in the neural network training context would make it so that we're kind of getting like a smooth gradient. Like we're looking at like kind of the overall shape of the hill instead of like each individual spike, right? That's great. The part that sucks about this is that you have to remember the whole time frame that you're averaging over. And that costs memory, and it also costs compute, because every time you calculate the average, you have to resum, or you have to at the very least add the latest and minus the one before. You could probably get away with like compute being okay, but you at least have to remember all of the samples, because you have to know how much to subtract when you remove one, right? And so if you just change your constraints a little bit, you can kind of get the idea of this moving average with one number, right? And so, like, the constraints we add here are 1, never forget. Never forget. Memes in the chat, please. What do we never forget? Well, in this case, it's those temperature samples, but there's other stuff that we might never forget as well. And the other thing is, if we never forget, then that means that, like, the stuff in the past will influence us forever, which is not really great. So maybe we want to say, like, care about recent stuff. More about new. New is always better, right? That's what we always say. So we care more about new stuff, but we also never forget. And it's like, how can you have both of those? Well, you can do this thing called like exponential decay. So instead of like weighting each of these guys the same, you can kind of weight them like this. Whoop, right? Where you say like the guy at the front is like most important. This guy's half as 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 important. And if you do that, basically, eventually, the stuff that happened in the past is like so many times half as important that it's like essentially noise and not really relevant. And it turns out that you can calculate this really easily, right? If you say every time I get a new sample, my new average is the old average times, like, you could say like 0.5, right? We'll just half the old average and then add in the new data, right? And you might want to scale this a little bit, but like whatever. This is kind of like hand wavy, a way to like kind of say, well, like, remember all the old stuff that happened, but like every step of this thing, we're multiplying everything that we had before by 0.5, which means every step, the things that happened in the past have been, like, things that have happened longer ago have been multiplied by 0.5 more times and been halved more times and have become less relevant. Okay? So that's exponential decay. Now, you could kind of structure this a little bit differently. Say that you had this in you had this like a 0.1. If you wanted to express this as like a ratio, you could like multiply the new data by 0.9, right? And then that kind of gives you like, okay, so I'm taking 90% of the new thing and 10% of the old thing. And then maybe that's a little bit better to reason about. Maybe I think this might scale it a little bit better to like be in the same space now. Now you're not going to like grow by mistake. But it's kind of like the same idea, right? You're just like, I'm going to take 90% of this thing, 10% of what we had before. The stuff that happened in the past gets smaller over time and becomes irrelevant. But we like still affects us, so we still get some of the nice like smoothing properties of like a low pass filter or a moving average. Okay, so we have exponential decay, which is like moving average, but cheap. Right? This gives all the same thing. So that actually, shockingly, knocks off this. Right? And this kind of. These are kind of saying M and V in this are moving averages of something. We haven't really talked about what yet, but there's something. They have this like beta term, which basically says like, how much do I care? What's the ratio I care about the new thing versus the old thing? And it's probably called beta because, you know, the old guy is a little beta boy and the new guys are the big new awesome big brothers coming in and overriding whatever the little beta boy said before. Shut up. Never mind. Okay, so we have some moving averages of some stuff, right? We haven't talked about what that stuff is yet, but we have moving averages. We can call them recency biased moving averages. How about? 1 minus beta should be called alpha. Yeah, so true. Well, we actually have alpha down here, so we could probably extend the metaphor a little bit, but never mind. Okay. What is this? This is like, basically like the calculus way of writing how much did our incorrectness contribute to the answer. So we're basically, this M is basically like, take an average of the signal over time, right? We can kind of pretend just like we just replace every time we see like weird D thing L over weird D thing W, we just call this like X. We just call this like the number we care about, right? So if you had your signal like we were talking about before that has like some sort of like noisy parabola shape or something, like the DL over DWT or whatever the fuck that thing is like the answer, the number that we got. So that kind of explains this guy. That's really obvious. Moving average, great. We have a smooth signal. What is this next parameter? VT. They just square the input. So it's like, okay, so they're doing the same thing. They're taking an average of the square. Why would you do that? Let's talk about variance. So next concept is variance. So when you like have like, you know, when you're like at school and they have like the bell curve, right? They're like, hey, we're going to, we assume that, you know, your grades fit this distribution and we need to like center this distribution at 70% because we wrote a really shit exam and you all failed, right? That happens all the time in university, or at least it did when I was at university. This thing has like mean, average, which is like the center point, but kind of like there's more information about this curve that you're not really capturing with that number. The other thing that you want to capture is like, was everybody really close together to the same answer, or were we kind of like really spread out, right? And so this is like what they call variance, and you can kind of represent this as like, They call it standard deviation. And when you calculate this, you'd say for each sample in this, for each data point that we have, can we compare it to the mean? So we take like data point minus mean, and then we square it, and then we add all those together, and then we square root them. I think that there's a way to think about this in terms of like you like geometry, right? You have like a squared, b squared, c squared, and then you like square root to get the length of c. I don't really know. There's some connection to like Euclidean geometry there. I don't know what it is, but it's there. But like hand wavy variance, i.e., how noisy the data is, how far we get from the center, can be represented as a sum of squares, and then you square root that whole thing. Hand wavy, right? And you might say that like you're supposed to do subtract the mean from this thing, but for the context of our gradients, we can like make the assumption kind of that like if we are trying, these are meant as a way for us to push a parameter towards like a correct value, right? And so you can imagine if you're near the correct value, you're probably jumping over it right, left, right, left. You're probably like kind of trying to center in on some like correct thing, right? So you could kind of justify to yourselves that like the average of the gradient over time should be somewhere around 0, hopefully, right? Because we're hopefully hopping over the parameter. So you could kind of justify that this is like variance that way. You could also justify this as saying anytime you have any noisy signal versus a flat signal, the sum of squares will always be higher than or equal to the sum, right? So if you're like multiplying each of your samples and then dividing them, and you multiply the squares of your samples and then divide them, the multiplication of the squares will always be higher. So even if it's not a perfect like representation of variance, it's like we can still use it as a number that grows when the data is more wiggly, right? We can kind of think of it this way. So all this is like, we can consider V as like, am I wiggly or flat? The flatter I am, the closer V and M become. And the more wiggly I am, the bigger V is relative to M, right? Easy. So we have like recency biased average of the data, as well as recency biased average of the noisiness, right? And what do you do with those two numbers? Ignore this for a second. You could imagine that you would just do the average over the variance, kind of hand wavy variance. This, as the paper calls it, is a approximate signal to noise ratio, right? So the idea here is that this will be 1 if your data is like very consistent, and less than 1, lower than 1, approaching 0 as your data becomes very inconsistent, right? Which you can imagine is a good, useful piece of information here. I guess it's M over root V, actually, if we're going to be a little bit correct about this. M over root V. You want, probably, in the context of neural networks, if you're trying to find this like bottom section, you probably want to take bigger steps towards the direction you're moving if the data agrees with itself, right? So if we're like flip-flopping back and forth over and over again, then you want to take smaller steps. So all of this stuff is just to say here, alpha here is like a learning rate. How big of steps like do we want to take? All of this is essentially saying, take steps that are bigger when it's consistent, and bigger when and weight the step according to like a low pass filter. Ignore noise at both like a small scale and at a large scale is essentially what this is saying. Now, there's a couple extra things in here, right? So what about this like little epsilon term in here? There's like this guy here. This is just because like, what if square root of V is 0, right? So you're like, square root of V is 0, you'd be dividing by 0. This is like invalid. So you just like throw a small number on there to like fix that problem. They throw a couple hats on the letters. Why are they doing this? Well, because hand wavy at the beginning of training, your exponential decay is like starting from 0, right? And you're like you kind of want like at the beginning to consider the past less, right? Because the past actually didn't actually happen, right? And so what they do here is they say do 1 minus beta to the power of t, where t is like the amount of steps that we've taken in this algorithm. And so if you imagine that b is like some small number, right? B is 0.1, right? You're gonna, on your first step, do divide by 0.9. And then on your second step, you're gonna divide by 0.99. And on the third step, you're gonna divide by 0.999, right? Or maybe we're, I might be orders of magnitude off there. But the idea here is like the same, that just over time, this is going to approach 1. It's going to approach 1 very quickly, but for the first few steps, we're going to take less. We're going to consider the past less and the future more, right? You could do the same thing here by just like turning up beta over time. You could just start beta at 0.5, and then like every time you take a step, just turn it up a little bit for the first few steps. This would do the same thing, but this is like a nice little like mathy way to do it for free, right? So that's all these are like, don't fucking like, don't look at like the stuff that didn't happen. Only look at like basically ramp up into doing your moving average. Start with a moving average of a few things, then increase to a moving average of more things. And then we're kind of there, right? Then the last piece here is we take this like moving average of the gradients, kind of weighted, low pass filtered so that we're only looking at like smoothed data, and we're considering it more if the data is consistent. All of that is just added to the previous weight. That's it, right? So we actually get there like quite easily. And you start with this thing, it's like, who the fuck would ever look at this? Who would ever like come up with this? And each part is actually not that crazy. And so you get to this thing where it's like, it's actually kind of beautiful, right? You're just like, oh, I keep track of like a couple extra numbers per parameter. And this allows me to get how noisy the data is at a large scale, how it allows me to remove noise at the small scale. And then we just do a little bit of extra work to avoid, divisions by 0 and some like degenerate case at the beginning. Easy, sick. So that's Adam. So, I think what I'm going to do for this stream is we're going to implement this, but I think I'm going to split this VOD for YouTube in 2, because I think that the explanation portion probably has like a wider reach than the like coding portion, and it's like, so like as like a short 20-minute explanation, we can kind of like package that as its own thing. So I'm going to quickly tell the people watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. If you want to see more, we'll link the next part. We might put it up a day later, not sure. But we'll link the next part if you want to see us implement that in our neural network training framework. If you like what you saw, we stream most days at 12:30 Pacific time to 4 o'clock Pacific time on Twitch. There's a link in the description. And swing by if you want to see. Check out the other videos if you want to see like coding stuff. But thanks for watching. There's a Patreon, etc. if you want to, sponsor the stream in some way, but that's all we're going to say. So, click the link below to see the rest. And then for you guys on Twitch, let's just keep fucking going.